They said his name like a curse. Elijah Carter. 19 years old. Worked the mill, kept his head down, never once talked back to a white man. But one hot afternoon, a white girl tripped, and by sundown, the story twisted into a crime that never happened. By nightfall, the sheriff had him in chains, and a crowd had gathered with ropes. But something happened the town didn't expect. From the dark edge of Dover's Hollow came voices, hundreds of them. Men, women, children, marching with lanterns, singing the old freedom hymns their ancestors whispered in the fields. They didn't come with guns. They came with unity. And for the first time, the town that ruled by fear was afraid. Because when the powerless stand together, even a lie built on hate can burn down the truth that made it. And that night, Dover's Hollow learned what justice really sounds like. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The heat pressed down on Dover's Hollow like a wet blanket. Dust hung in the air, refusing to settle in the thick humidity. Elijah Carter wiped sweat from his brow as he hefted another flour sack onto his shoulder. The rough fabric scratched against his neck. But he didn't mind. Work was work, and helping at Dalton's general store meant a few extra pennies. "That's the last one, Miss Maybelle," Elijah said, his voice soft as he placed the sack carefully in the back of the wagon. Maybelle Dalton stood nearby, her pale dress somehow still crisp despite the heat. She twisted a handkerchief between her fingers, glancing nervously toward the store where her father sorted inventory. "Thank you, Elijah," she whispered. Her eyes never quite met his. "I don't know how I would have managed these by myself." Elijah nodded. "No trouble at all." As he turned to leave, one of the sacks shifted. Maybelle gasped as it started to tip. Without thinking, Elijah reached out, his hand steadying the falling sack. His fingers brushed against Maybelle's waist for just a moment as she stepped back. "There we go," he said, adjusting the load. "All set now." "Thank you," Maybelle repeated, her cheeks flushing pink. Elijah took 2 steps back, tipped his worn cap politely, and turned away. The rules were clear in Dover's Hollow. Do your work. Keep your eyes down. Move along. Sits. Mayfield stood frozen on the sidewalk, her marketing basket clutched to her chest, her thin lips pressed together as she watched the exchange. When Elijah walked past, he nodded respectfully, but her eyes only narrowed in response. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. But she turned away as if he hadn't spoken. Elijah didn't think anything of it. Some white folks never acknowledged him at all. That was just how things were. He headed toward the bottom, the part of town where black families lived, eager to get home to his mother's cooking. Behind him, Mrs. Mayfield hurried into Dalton's store, her voice carrying through the open door. "Henry Dalton, do you know what I just saw? That Carter boy putting his hands on your daughter." Inside the store, customers fell silent. Henry Dalton's face darkened as he came around the counter. "What did you say?" "Mrs." Mayfield's voice dropped to a dramatic whisper, but it carried through the stillness. Right there in broad daylight, his hands on her waist. "Bold as you please." A woman gasped. Someone muttered, "Disgraceful." By the time Elijah had walked 3 blocks, the whisper had grown legs. At the barber shop, Mr. Wilson stood in the doorway, watching Elijah pass. "Heard that Carter boy got handsy with Miss Maybelle," he said to his customer. 2 blocks later, Mrs. Jenkins leaned over her fence to tell Mrs. Parker, "That mill boy tried to grab Henry Dalton's daughter." The words raced through town faster than Elijah's steady steps could carry him home. In the bottom, Reverend Tillman was sitting on his porch when Elijah passed. The older man's face was lined with worry. "Elijah, you been up to the Dalton store today?" Elijah stopped, surprised by the question. "Yes, sir. Just helping with some flour sacks." The Reverend nodded slowly. "You best get on home. I'm hearing talk already." "Talk, sir?" Just get on home to your mama. Stay there tonight." Confused, Elijah quickened his pace. The dirt road to his small cabin felt longer than usual. Something cold settled in his stomach, though he couldn't say why. His mother, Lottie Carter, was stirring a pot of beans when he pushed open the door. Her face brightened at the sight of him. "There's my boy. Wash up now. Cornbread's nearly done." Elijah did as he was told, splashing water on his face from the basin. Reverend Tillman seemed strange just now. "Asked if I'd been to Dalton's today?" Lottie's hand paused mid-stir. "Did something happen there?" "No, ma'am. Just loaded some flour sacks." His mother watched him carefully. "You be extra careful around those white folks, Elijah. You know that." "Yes, ma'am. Always am." They sat down to dinner as the sun began to set. Elijah said grace like always, thanking God for the food and for his mother's hands that prepared it. The beans were hot and flavorful, the cornbread golden. They ate in comfortable silence until Lottie spoke. "Clara Jenkins came by earlier, said Sheriff's been asking questions about you." Elijah put down his spoon. "Me? Why?" "Wouldn't say." Lottie's eyes were worried. "But nothing good comes from that man's attention." Before Elijah could respond, heavy boots stomped onto their porch. The door shook with pounding fists. "Open up in there! Sheriff's Department!" Lottie stood so quickly her chair fell backward. "Elijah?" "I ain't done nothing, Mama," he whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. The door crashed open. Sheriff Earl Dunning filled the frame, his badge catching the lamplight. Two deputies flanked him, hands on their gun belts. "Elijah Carter," Dunning growled. "You're coming with us." Lottie stepped between them. "What for? My son's done nothing." Dunning shoved her aside. "Your boy insulted a white girl today. Henry Dalton wants justice." "What? No, sir." Elijah started, but a deputy's fist slammed into his jaw. "Don't you talk back, boy." They grabbed Elijah by the arms, dragging him toward the door. He didn't fight. Fighting meant dying. But his eyes sought his mother's. "Mama!" Lottie screamed, clawing at the second deputy. "Leave him be! He's a good boy!" A backhanded slap sent her to the floor. Elijah struggled then, panic overtaking caution. "Don't touch my mama!" The beating came swift and brutal. Fists and boots rained down until Elijah tasted blood. They hauled him outside, his legs barely supporting him. "Please," he gasped. "I never—" "Shut your mouth," Dunning hissed, shoving him into the back of a wagon. "You'll hang for this." Lottie staggered onto the porch, her face wet with tears. "My baby! Elijah!" The sheriff climbed onto the wagon seat. "Get back inside, woman, unless you want trouble too." As the wagon pulled away, Elijah saw lanterns glowing in the darkness. White faces, grim with purpose, lined the road toward town. Behind him, his mother's wails faded beneath the growing murmurs of the crowd. "String him up! Teach him a lesson! No trial needed for his kind." Blood trickled down Elijah's face as he closed his eyes. He'd done nothing but his job, followed all the unwritten rules. Now he was being hauled to judgment for a crime that had never happened. The wagon wheels creaked beneath him, carrying him toward whatever waited in town. The iron cuffs bit into Elijah's wrists as he huddled in the corner of Dover's Hollow's one-room jail. Blood trickled from the raw skin beneath the metal, but that pain was nothing compared to the throbbing in his face, where the deputy's fists had landed. The brick walls seemed to close in around him. A single barred window let in the fading daylight and, worse, the growing noise from the square outside. There he is, the one who touched Miss May Bell. Animals, all of them. Hang him. Make him pay. Elijah pressed his forehead against the cool brick wall. His split lips stung with each breath. He'd done nothing wrong. Nothing. Just helped a girl with flour sacks. Now he was going to die for it. "Lord," he whispered, "please help my mama. She'll be all alone. Outside, the square filled with more people by the minute. Women in house dresses stood beside men still dusty from the fields or the mill. Children darted between legs, excited by the commotion without understanding its meaning. The crowd pressed toward the jailhouse door, where Sheriff Dunning paced back and forth, one hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Now, folks," Dunning called out, raising his hands, "I know you're upset, but we do things proper in Dover's Hollow." "Proper would be a rope," someone shouted from the back. Dunning's mouth twitched, almost a smile before he forced it into a stern line. "The boy's locked up safe. Justice will be done, I promise you that." A farmer pushed to the front. "What did he do exactly, Sheriff?" "I heard different stories." Dunning leaned in, lowering his voice just enough that people had to strain to hear, ensuring every word carried weight. "Well, I shouldn't say too much before the judge arrives, but—" He paused for effect. The boy practically confessed. Didn't even deny putting his hands on Miss May Bell. The crowd growled. Elijah hadn't confessed to anything. They'd barely let him speak at all. "That true, Sheriff? He admitted it?" asked Mrs. Mayfield, who now stood proudly at the center of attention. "Let's just say he knew exactly what he'd done wrong," Dunning replied. "These boys always do." The crowd pushed closer. Someone threw an empty bottle that smashed against the jail wall. Into this dangerous current walked Reverend Isaiah Tillman, his spine straight despite his 60 years. The crowd parted slightly, not out of respect, but surprise. Black folks rarely came to the square after dark, especially on nights like this. "Sheriff Dunning," the Reverend called, his deep voice steady. "A word, if I may." Dunning's face hardened. "This isn't church business, Reverend. When a boy's life hangs in the balance, it becomes the Lord's business." Tillman stepped closer, ignoring the mutters around him. "Elijah Carter is a member of my congregation, a good, hard-working young man. I'm asking you to ensure he receives a fair trial." "Fair?" Dunning scoffed. "Like the one your daddy got after he stole those chickens? That kind of fair?" The Reverend didn't flinch. "My father died 50 years ago, Sheriff, and he never stole anything in his life. That's not how I heard it." Dunning stepped closer, towering over the older man. "Look around you, Reverend. These good people want justice. I'm the only thing standing between your boy and that tree over there." He pointed to the large oak at the edge of the square. "The law promises him a trial," Tillman insisted. Dunning laughed. "Laws for men, not boys from the bottom. You know that." He leaned in closer. "But if you want to join him in that cell, keep talking." Reverend Tillman held the sheriff's gaze for a long moment before turning away. As he walked back through the crowd, someone spat at his feet. He didn't break stride. Across town, in the tidy White House behind Dalton's general store, May Bell sat on her bed, trembling. Her eyes were red from crying. Her father paced before her, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Daddy, please," she whispered. "I need to tell the truth. Elijah didn't do anything wrong." Henry Dalton whirled around. "Not another word. You hear me? Half the town saw him put his hands on you." "But he didn't. He was just catching a sack that was falling." The slap echoed in the small bedroom. May Bell's head snapped to the side, her cheek blooming red beneath her fair skin. "You listen to me, girl." Henry's voice was low and dangerous. "A white girl's words all that stands between us and shame. You think anyone will shop at our store if they think my daughter's been ruined? You think any decent boy will marry you? But they're going to hurt him," Maybelle sobbed. "Mrs. Wilson said they might even—" "That's not our concern." Henry knocked back his whiskey. "Our concern is this family's good name. You'll stay in this room tonight, and if anyone asks, you tell them that slave boy grabbed you. Understand?" Maybelle stared at her father, tears streaming down her face. When she didn't answer, he grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise. "Understand? "Yes, Daddy," she whispered. Night fell over Dover's Hollow like a shroud. The crowd in the square had grown, fueled by whiskey and hatred. Lanterns and torches cast long, dancing shadows across angry faces. Women had gone home, but more men had arrived. Rough men from the outskirts, who rarely came to town except for trouble. From his cell, Elijah could hear it all. The shouts, the laughter, the promises of what they'd do to him. He sank to his knees and prayed, his bloodied wrists pressed together. "Lord, I ain't ready to die. But if it's my time, please watch over Mama." Sheriff Dunning stood on the jailhouse steps, watching as 3 men approached with coils of rope slung over their shoulders. "That for fishing, boys?" he called, grinning. "Got us a big catch tonight, Sheriff," one replied, to raucous laughter. Dunning took out a cigar, biting off the end and spitting it into the dust. He struck a match against the wall, the flame illuminating his satisfied smirk as he puffed it to life. Law and order in Dover's Hollow meant keeping people in their place. Tonight would remind everyone exactly where that was. "Might need to step aside soon, Sheriff," someone called. "Wouldn't want you to get that nice uniform dirty." Dunning blew a perfect smoke ring. "Just doing my duty, protecting the prisoner as long as I can." He winked. "Course, if you boys overwhelm me, what can one man do?" The crowd roared its approval. They surged forward, pressing toward the jailhouse door. Then something strange happened. A sound carried on the night air. Faint at first, then growing. Singing. Low, strong voices lifting in perfect harmony. The mob paused, confused. The singing grew louder, rolling through the humid night like distant thunder. The words became clear, an old spiritual that sent a chill through the square. "Go down, Moses. Way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go." Every head turned toward the road that led to the bottom. The singing grew louder, stronger, more voices joining with each verse. The crowd in the square shifted nervously. "What the hell?" Dunning muttered, the cigar nearly falling from his lips. The hymn swelled, carried by dozens, then hundreds of voices. It rolled across the square like a wave, powerful and unafraid. "When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go." The singing grew louder, filling the night air with a defiance that was both peaceful and powerful. Then came the lights. First just a few, then dozens of flickering lanterns bobbing along the dark road that led from the bottom. They moved with purpose, like fireflies with a mission, drawing closer to the town square. "What in tarnation?" Sheriff Dunning muttered, squinting into the darkness. The white mob turned as one, their lynching plans momentarily forgotten. The lanterns revealed faces, black faces, scores of them, then hundreds. Men in their church clothes, women with heads held high, even children clutching their parents' hands. They marched in orderly lines, singing that haunting spiritual with unwavering voices. At their front walked Reverend Tillman, Bible in hand, his gray head uncovered despite the custom to wear a hat before white folks. Beside him strode Clara Jenkins, a short, sturdy woman whose laundry business had cleaned the shirts of half the white men now standing slack-jawed in the square. Her eyes, usually downcast when serving white customers, now blazed with a fire that dared anyone to look away. "Who do they think they are?" someone in the mob whispered. The procession kept coming. They carried baskets of food, hymn books, and jugs of water. No guns, no knives, not even a single stick. Just voices and bodies and a determination that thickened the air. "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land." The singing didn't falter as they reached the edge of the square. They spread out, forming a living barrier between the jail and the would-be lynchers. Reverend Tillman raised his hand, and the singing softened, but didn't stop. "Sheriff Dunning," the Reverend called, his voice carrying across the now quiet square. "If there is to be law, let it be law for all." We will stand here till morning if we must. Dunning's face flushed red, visible even in the lamplight. You're interfering with official business, Reverend. We're witnessing justice, Clara Jenkins spoke up, her voice sharp as a razor. Making sure it happens in a courtroom, not under a tree. The sheriff's hand moved to his gun. I can have you all arrested for disturbing the peace. There's no peace being disturbed here, the Reverend replied calmly. Only peace being kept. An older white man pushed forward. Dunning, you gonna let them get away with this? Running our town? The sheriff looked around, calculating. The black folk outnumbered the white mob at least 2-1 now. More importantly, they stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an unbroken human wall around the jailhouse. To get to Elijah, the lynchers would have to push through grandmothers, children, ministers, all while the world watched. What in God's name are they doing? A farmer muttered, voicing the confusion many felt. Clara Jenkins stepped forward, hands on her hips. We're showing you what community looks like, Mr. Peterson. Something you might want to try sometime. Some of the white men shifted uncomfortably, recognizing women who had raised their children, men who fixed their wagons, boys who delivered their goods, neighbors they barely acknowledged, suddenly standing before them as people. Inside the small brick jail, Elijah sat with his back against the wall, listening. At first, he thought he was imagining the singing, a comfort his mind had conjured before death. But as the voices grew closer, stronger, he realized what was happening. His people, the folks from the bottom, had come for him, not with guns or revenge, but with their presence, their witness. Tears streamed down his bruised face. He didn't deserve this bravery. These people were risking everything, their jobs, their homes, maybe even their lives, for him. Elijah crawled to the tiny window and pressed his face against the bars, trying to see. "We hear you, Elijah," someone called out. "We're here with you, son." "Stay strong, boy," came another voice. The standoff continued as the night deepened, neither side willing to yield. The white mob gradually thinned as some men, faced with actual resistance rather than an easy lynching, drifted away to their beds. But many stayed, passing bottles and muttering threats. The black community remained unmoved. When children grew tired, they were passed back to sleep in wagons parked nearby. When thirst came, water jugs were shared. When hunger gnawed, the food baskets were opened. Through it all, the singing continued, sometimes loud and defiant, sometimes soft and prayerful, but never stopping. Tension crackled in the air like dry wood ready to burn. One wrong move, one shot fired, one stone thrown could ignite a blaze that would consume them all. Everyone knew it. No one struck the match. Sheriff Dunning paced the jailhouse steps, checking his pocket watch repeatedly, waiting for reinforcements that never came. His deputies looked to him for guidance, but he had no plan for this. Force would create martyrs. Waiting meant losing face. As the eastern sky began to lighten, painting the clouds in delicate pinks and golds, Dunning's patience finally snapped. He marched to the edge of the steps and raised his voice. "This ends now! I'm ordering all of you to disperse immediately or face consequences." The singing paused. Reverend Tillman stepped forward, hands clasped before him. His face showed the fatigue of a sleepless night, but his voice remained steady. "We are not afraid of daylight, Sheriff." The words hung in the morning air, simple but profound. A murmur of agreement rippled through the black crowd. They stood taller, shoulders squared, as the first rays of sunlight touched their faces. No masks, no hoods, no darkness to hide behind. Just people standing openly for what was right. Dunning spat on the ground, his contempt clear. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed off toward the telegraph office, his boot heels striking the boardwalk like angry hammers. "He's going to call the state patrol," someone whispered. Clara Jenkins just nodded. her face set. Let him. By the time they get here, half the county will know what's happening in Dover's Hollow. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the square, illuminating two communities facing each other across an invisible line. One clinging to the old ways of fear and force, the other standing firm in newfound solidarity, neither knowing what the day would bring, but both understanding that something had already changed in the night. Morning light spilled over Dover's Hollow, painting the town in gold and revealing a community divided. The square looked nothing like its usual self. White-owned shops remained shuttered, their owners peering nervously through curtained windows. Meanwhile, the black families who had stood vigil through the night were now setting up makeshift cooking stations. Women stirred pots of grits and beans over small fires, the smell of cornbread wafting across the square. Inside his cell, Elijah Carter knelt on the hard floor. His bruised face still showed traces of dried tears, but his hands were steady as they clasped in prayer. The words came softly, barely above a whisper. "Lord, I ain't never asked for much," he murmured, "but I'm asking now. Not just for me. For all of them out there, risking everything." The jail's single window offered a slice of sky, and the sounds of his community standing firm. Elijah closed his eyes, drawing strength from their presence. Across town, Sheriff Earl Dunning burst into the telegraph office, startling the young operator who had just opened for the day. "Get me a line to Jackson," Dunning demanded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the early hour. "State Patrol Office." The operator's fingers moved quickly across the keys, tapping out the connection request. When the line was secured, Dunning pushed him aside and began writing his message. "Urgent stop slave uprising in progress. In Dover's Hollow Stop Jail surrounded. Stop request. Immediate assistance. Stop situation. Volatile. Stop Sheriff Dunning." He handed it to the operator with a grim smile. "Send it twice. Make sure they understand the danger we're in." The young man nodded nervously, his eyes darting to the window where he could see black families calmly serving breakfast to children and elders. No weapons, no shouting, no violence, just people standing together. But he knew better than to question the sheriff. "Yes, sir," he said, and began tapping out the message. By mid-morning, the first automobile rolled into town, kicking up dust from the road. Two men in pressed shirts and hats stepped out, cameras and notepads in hand. Reporters from the Meridian Star, drawn by rumors of trouble brewing in the small town. Sheriff Dunning spotted them immediately and straightened his badge, smoothing his mustache before approaching with an outstretched hand. "Gentlemen, you've come at a critical time," he said, his voice pitched to carry. "I'm doing everything in my power to prevent bloodshed." One reporter scribbled notes while the other adjusted his camera. "Can you tell us what started this disturbance, Sheriff?" Dunning positioned himself so the jailhouse and the gathered black community would form his backdrop. "A dangerous criminal attacked a white girl. I arrested him lawfully, and now his people are attempting to obstruct justice." The camera flashed as Dunning posed, hand on his gun belt, face set in stern determination. The perfect picture of authority standing against chaos. What the camera couldn't capture was the reality across the square, where Reverend Tillman sat on the courthouse steps beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Around him, a circle of men and women listened intently as he outlined their strategy. "We need 3 groups," the Reverend explained, his deep voice calm but firm. "One to maintain our position here, one to fetch supplies and bring news to and from the bottom, and one to rest so they can take over when night falls again." Clara Jenkins stood nearby, nodding in agreement. Her practical mind had already begun organizing. "The Harris sisters can coordinate the food. We've got enough to last 2 days if we're careful." "What about the children?" Mrs. Washington asked, bouncing a fussy baby on her hip. "We'll set up a quiet space in the back of the wagons," Clara decided. The older ones can help with simple tasks, keep them occupied. As the meeting continued, Clara noticed several older men gathered at the edge of the crowd. Men who rarely came to church services or town gatherings. Men who had served in France during the Great War and returned to a country that still treated them as less than citizens. She caught the eye of Moses Wright, a weathered farmer who had been a sergeant in the colored infantry. While the others discussed water distribution, Clara slipped away to speak with Moses and his friends. "You men still keep those rifles from the war?" she asked quietly, her voice too low for anyone else to hear. Moses didn't answer directly. "What are you asking, Miss Clara?" "I'm asking if you're prepared to protect these people if things turn ugly," she replied, her gaze steady. "Not to start anything, just to finish it if needed." The men exchanged glances, a silent communication born of shared experience. "There might be some hunting equipment stored near the edge of the woods," Moses finally said, "just in case deer season comes early this year." Clara nodded once. "Make sure it stays hidden, but close." Across town, May Belle Dalton sat at her bedroom window, watching rain clouds gather on the horizon. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. Downstairs, her father's voice rose and fell in waves of anger as he paced the parlor. "Uppity slaves think they run this town now." Henry Dalton's shout carried through the floorboards, standing there like they got rights, like they matter. Maybelle flinched at each harsh word. Her hand moved unconsciously to her waist, where Elijah's fingers had briefly, innocently touched, while steadying a falling flour sack. A touch she'd barely noticed until Mrs. Mayfield gasped, and her father started asking questions. Questions that scared her into silence, then into lies. A tear slid down her cheek as she watched dark clouds roll closer. What had she done? A boy might die because she was too afraid to speak the truth. By evening, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, pattering on the tin roofs and turning the dusty square to mud. The protesters huddled under hastily erected canvas shelters, passing dry blankets to the elderly and children. Their resolve remained unbroken, even as the sky opened up above them. Reverend Tillman pulled his coat collar up against the rain as he made his way to Miss Lottie Carter's small cabin at the edge of the bottom. Elijah's mother opened the door before he could knock, her eyes hollow with worry. "Any news, Reverend?" she asked, pulling him inside out of the downpour. "He's safe for now," Tillman assured her, removing his soaked hat. "Our people won't leave him. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever." Lottie collapsed into a chair, her strong laundress hands trembling as she covered her face. "My boy never touched that girl. You know Elijah. He wouldn't." "I know," the Reverend said gently, sitting across from her. "And somehow, we'll prove it." As he rose to leave, promising to return with updates, Clara Jenkins appeared at the door, rain dripping from her shawl. Her eyes shone with purpose as she pulled the Reverend aside. "I just heard something interesting," she whispered, glancing to make sure Lottie couldn't hear. "Mary, who cleans at the Dalton house, says Deputy Carl Dunning, the sheriff's own cousin, was seen near Maybelle the day before all this happened, and not for the first time." Reverend Tillman's eyes widened slightly, a small spark of understanding igniting in his mind. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded firmly. "Mary says the deputy's been sweet on Maybelle for months. Follows her around town when he thinks nobody's watching." The Reverend stood silent for a moment, rain pattering on the roof above them, as the pieces began coming together in his mind. 2 nights later, the rain had stopped, leaving Dover's Hollow damp and restless. The streets smelled of mud and smoke, a mixture that hung in the air like a warning. The moon peeked through scattered clouds, casting silver light on puddles that reflected a town holding its breath. May Belle Dalton stood at her bedroom window, watching her father's snores rise and fall beneath his quilt. When she was certain he wouldn't wake, she slipped a shawl over her nightdress and took a small brass candle holder from her dresser. Her hands shook as she lit the wick, the tiny flame dancing with her fear. Moving silently, she crept down the stairs, wincing at each creak of wood beneath her feet. At the back door, she paused, listening for any sign she'd been discovered. Hearing nothing but the distant chorus of frogs from the creek, she slipped outside into the night. The mud sucked at her shoes as she hurried through back alleys, keeping to the shadows. She clutched her candle with one hand, using the other to hold her shawl tight against the damp night air. Her heart pounded so hard she was certain anyone nearby could hear it. Maybelle had never been to the bottom before. White folks rarely ventured into the black section of town, especially after dark. But she knew where to find Reverend Tillman's church, a simple wooden building with a small cross that caught the moonlight as she approached. She hesitated at the door, nearly turning back. What would her father say if he knew? What would anyone say? But the image of Elijah being dragged through the street, his face bloody and confused, pushed her forward. She knocked softly, then harder, when no one answered. Eventually, a light appeared in the window. The door opened just enough for Reverend Tillman's weathered face to peer out, surprise crossing his features when he recognized his visitor. "Miss Dalton?" His voice was cautious, measured. "It's dangerous for you to be here." "Please," she whispered, "I need to talk to you." He glanced behind her, checking for followers, then stepped aside to let her enter. The church was modest but clean, with worn wooden pews facing a simple altar. A single oil lamp cast long shadows across the walls. "No one saw me come," she assured him, though she couldn't be certain. The Reverend nodded, keeping a respectful distance. "What brings you here at this hour, child?" Maybelle's carefully rehearsed words dissolved. She began to cry, her shoulders shaking with the force of her guilt. "He never touched me," she finally managed through her tears. "Elijah, he never did anything wrong." The Reverend's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes softened slightly. "Go on," he urged. "I tripped while he was helping me," she explained, the words tumbling out faster now. "The sack was heavy, and I stumbled. He caught my arm to steady me. That's all that happened. But Mrs. Mayfield saw, and then everyone was talking, and my father—" She swallowed hard. "I didn't mean for it to spread. I didn't mean for any of this." Reverend Tillman stood silent, absorbing her confession. His mind worked quickly behind his calm exterior, weighing consequences and possibilities. The truth should have been a relief, proof of Elijah's innocence. But the Reverend understood the dark reality of their situation. If Maybelle spoke publicly now, admitting she'd lied, her own community would turn on her. White Dover's Hollow would never forgive the girl who destroyed their narrative. She might even be killed for the betrayal. And Elijah, even with her confession, they'd find another reason to hang him, claiming he'd humiliated a white family. The truth, in this case, wouldn't set either of them free. "Miss Dalton," he said finally, his voice gentle but firm, "I believe you, but we need to be very careful about how we handle this." "I'll tell them all," she insisted, desperate for absolution. "I'll go to the sheriff right now." The Reverend shook his head slowly. "That would be unwise, for both you and Elijah." He moved to his desk and returned with paper and a pencil. "Write what you've told me. Keep it simple. Then sign your name." Maybelle looked confused, but took the items with trembling hands. She wrote carefully, confessing that Elijah had never touched her inappropriately, that she had tripped, and he had simply tried to help. She signed her full name at the bottom, the letters wobbly but legible. "I'll keep this safe," Reverend Tillman said, folding the paper and tucking it inside his Bible. "When the time is right, when it's safe, we'll decide how to use it. But Elijah will be protected," he assured her. "But not with this paper. Not yet." Maybelle looked uncertain, but nodded. "What should I do?" "Go home. Say nothing. Act normal," he instructed. Can you do that?" She nodded again, wiping her tears with her sleeve. After she left, slipping back into the night like a ghost, Reverend Tillman sat heavily in a chair, Maybelle's confession weighing on his conscience. An hour later, Clara Jenkins and Moses Wright arrived with 3 other veterans, responding to the Reverend's urgent message. They gathered in the back room of the church, speaking in hushed tones. "The girl confessed," Tillman explained, showing them the signed paper. "Elijah is innocent, as we knew. Thank the Lord," Clara breathed. "We can get him out now." "Not so simple," the Reverend cautioned. "If we use this, Maybelle becomes the target, and they'll still find a way to punish Elijah." "So what do we do?" Moses asked, his calloused hands clasped together. Reverend Tillman's eyes were troubled but determined. "Something I never thought I'd do. We fight a lie with another lie." He leaned forward. "We plant a new rumor, that a white man, not Elijah, was seen near Maybelle that day." "Who?" Clara asked. "Someone powerful enough that people will hesitate to accuse openly. Someone who will create doubt." The Reverend's voice was barely above a whisper. "The sheriff's cousin, Deputy Carl Dunning." The group exchanged uneasy glances. "It's not true?" one of the veterans asked. "Clara heard he's been sweet on the girl for months," Tillman explained. "That's enough truth to make the lie work." Clara nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. It might save both of them. "It's a dangerous game, Reverend," Moses warned. "More dangerous than doing nothing?" Tillman asked. "I've prayed on this. Sometimes the path to justice isn't straight." As dawn broke, casting pink light across the still damp town, Reverend Tillman made his way to the edge of town, where Jeb Wilson, a poor white field hand known to work alongside black laborers, was loading his wagon. "Morning, Reverend," Jeb nodded, surprised by the visit. "Morning, Jeb," Tillman replied casually. "Terrible business about young Elijah, isn't it?" "Sure is," Jeb agreed cautiously. The Reverend glanced around, then lowered his voice confidentially. "Between us, I heard the sheriff's cousin might have been the one seen near Maybelle that day. Deputy Carl. Folks say he's had his eye on her for some time." Jeb's eyebrows rose. "That so?" "Just what I heard," Tillman said with a shrug. "Thought it strange nobody's mentioned it." He walked away, leaving the seed planted. By midday, as he'd calculated, the gossip began to twist again, weaving its way through both sides of town like poison ivy, spreading fast and causing itch wherever it touched. By afternoon, Dover's Hollow had transformed from a town united in fury to one confused by whispers. The hot Mississippi sun beat down on huddles of townspeople gathered at street corners and storefront steps, their voices low but urgent. "You hear what they're saying?" Fenton the barber muttered to the blacksmith, as they watched Deputy Carl Dunning stride across the square. "Maybe it wasn't the Carter boy, after all." The blacksmith nodded slowly. "My wife heard from Mrs. Wilson that Dunning's own kin got seen around that girl before. Several times." They fell silent as the deputy passed, his face flushed with something more than just the heat. He'd been hearing these whispers all morning, each one cutting deeper than the last. Inside the courthouse, Sheriff Earl Dunning paced his office, cigar clenched between his teeth. "Who the hell started this nonsense about Carl?" he demanded of no one in particular. Outside, the peaceful gathering of black townspeople continued. They rotated in shifts now, some returning to the bottom to rest, others coming to take their place. They passed food, water, and clean clothes in a well-organized system. Reverend Tillman moved among them, offering prayers and encouragement, his face betraying nothing of his hand in the rumors now swirling through town. When Mayor Phillips approached him about the disturbing new allegations, the Reverend merely shook his head in practiced confusion. "Can't say I've heard much about that, Mayor," he said, his voice steady. "We're just here making sure young Elijah gets proper justice. Nothing more." The mayor wiped sweat from his brow. "This situation is getting out of hand, Reverend. Perhaps we could negotiate. At the jail, Clara Jenkins arrived with a covered basket. 2 deputies searched it thoroughly, finding only cornbread, beans, and a clean shirt. They escorted her inside, watching closely as she spoke to Elijah through the cell bars. Elijah looked terrible, one eye swollen shut, dried blood still crusting his hairline. He'd barely eaten since his arrest. "People are starting to see," Clara whispered, placing the food through the bars. "Don't lose hope." "What's happening out there?" Elijah asked, his voice hoarse. "God works in mysterious ways," she replied with a meaningful look. "The truth has a way of coming out, even if it's not the way we expect." The deputy stepped closer. "That's enough comfort for a guilty boy." Clara straightened her back, looking him directly in the eye. "The only guilt I see is in the faces of men who know they're wrong." Across town, the carefully maintained unity of White Dover's Hollow was cracking like old paint. At the drugstore, Dr. Morris questioned loudly why they were still holding the Carter boy, if there was doubt. "I'm just saying, if there's other possibilities, we ought to investigate before we do something we can't take back," he argued. "You defending a colored boy over the sheriff's word?" Tom Jackson challenged. "I'm defending the law," Morris shot back. "Since when do we hang first and ask questions later?" Similar arguments erupted throughout town. Some demanded proof before they took any further action against Elijah. Others whispered that the sheriff might be covering up for family. Wasn't it convenient how quickly he'd arrested the Carter boy? By late afternoon, Henry Dalton couldn't stand it anymore. The whispers had reached his store, customers eyeing Maybelle with new speculation. He slammed his ledger shut and stormed across the street to the courthouse. He found Sheriff Dunning at his desk, reviewing telegrams. "What the hell is going on, Earl?" Dalton demanded, his face mottled with rage. "People are saying your nephew had designs on my daughter." Sheriff Dunning rose slowly. "People say a lot of things, Henry, especially when they're stirred up." "Well, shut it down!" Dalton slammed his palm on the desk. "My girl's been through enough without having her name dragged through more mud." "My deputies are working on restoring order," Dunning replied coldly. "Once we deal with the troublemakers from the bottom—" "I'm not talking about them," Dalton interrupted. "I'm talking about your kin. Is it true? Was Carl sniffing around my Maybelle?" Deputy Carl chose that moment to enter the office. His face darkened when he saw Dalton. "You spreading lies about me, Dalton?" he snarled. Henry Dalton whirled around. "There, right there. If you were innocent, you wouldn't be so defensive." Carl lunged forward. "You calling me a liar?" Sheriff Dunning quickly stepped between them. "That's enough. Both of you. You're hiding something," Dalton accused, trying to push past the sheriff to get at the younger Dunning. "Everyone in town can see it." "Is that why you were so quick to blame the Carter boy?" "Get out of my office," the sheriff ordered, his voice deadly quiet, "before I decide your daughter's testimony isn't reliable after all." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Dalton's eyes widened with understanding. "You wouldn't dare," he whispered. "Try me," Dunning replied. "Now get out." Dalton backed away, pointing a shaking finger. "This isn't over, Earl. People are talking." After he left, the sheriff turned to his cousin. "Carl, you need to stay out of sight for a while." "I didn't do nothing," Carl protested. "Doesn't matter what you did," Dunning snapped. "What matters is what people think. We're losing control of this situation." As evening settled over Dover's Hollow, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Both sides of town simmered with unspoken fears and suspicions. Sheriff Dunning was finishing a report when the crash came. Glass shattering, sending shards flying across his desk. He ducked instinctively, then rose to see a brick on the floor amid the broken window. Written in white chalk across its rough surface was a single word: liar. He picked it up, hands trembling with rage. From the window, he could see nothing, just empty streets growing dark with twilight. It could have been thrown by anyone, White or black? That's what terrified him most. Deputy Carl burst in, gun drawn. What happened? Sheriff Dunning's composure finally cracked. The carefully maintained mask of lawful authority slipped, revealing the frightened man beneath. He hurled the brick against the wall. I'm done playing nice, he snarled. Get the boys together. All of them. What are we doing? Carl asked, a hungry gleam in his eye. A cleanup operation, Dunning replied, reaching for his shotgun. Tonight we remind folks who runs this town. He yanked open his desk drawer and pulled out several badges. Deputize the clan boys. Tell them to meet at midnight. And the colored folk at the jail? The sheriff's eyes were cold as winter. We'll handle them first. They want their precious Carter boy so bad. We'll give him to them, on a rope. Midnight settled over Dover's Hollow like a shroud. The wind shifted, carrying the first hints of smoke from the bottom. Sheriff Earl Dunning sat tall in his saddle, a torch blazing in his left hand, his shotgun resting across his lap. Behind him rode 6 men, 3 deputies and 3 others wearing hastily pinned badges that caught the torchlight. Remember, boys, Dunning called over his shoulder, we're restoring order, making sure these folks understand their place. The men nodded, their faces grim beneath hat brims pulled low. Each carried a torch and a weapon, pistols, shotguns, one with a coiled rope hanging from his saddle. They approached the bottom slowly, the soft clip-clop of hooves on packed earth, the only sound breaking the midnight quiet. The collection of wooden shacks and small homes sat dark and still. Most of the community remained at the jail, maintaining their vigil. Perfect, Dunning muttered. Homes undefended. Let's show them what happens when they challenge the law. He spurred his horse forward, leading his men down the main dirt path that served as the bottom's only street. They halted before a small cabin. One Dunning knew belonged to a man who'd been particularly vocal at the protest. This one first, he ordered, dismounting and approaching the door. He pounded 3 times. Sheriff's business! Open up! A frightened woman appeared, a baby clutched to her chest. My husband ain't here, she said, eyes wide with terror. That's the problem, isn't it? Dunning replied coldly. Should be home taking care of his family instead of making trouble. He stepped back, nodding to his men. 2 riders swung down from their horses, pushed past the woman, and entered the cabin. The sound of breaking furniture echoed into the night. Then they emerged, flinging their torches through the doorway and windows. The dry wood caught immediately. Orange flames licked up the walls as the woman ran screaming into the yard, the baby wailing in her arms. Move on! Dunning shouted, already heading toward another home. The second shack belonged to one of Clara Jenkins's cousins. They didn't bother with warnings this time. 2 men simply rode up and flung their torches onto the roof. As flames engulfed the structure, Dunning fired his shotgun into the air, the blast echoing through the night. People began pouring from their homes. Old men, women with children, teenagers frozen in terror. That's right, Dunning shouted. Run! Tell your men what happens when you try to take over my town. His deputies fired more shots into the air. Families scattered, fleeing toward the woods that bordered the bottom, carrying what little they could grab. Meanwhile, at her small house near the church, Clara Jenkins bolted upright at the sound of gunfire. She threw on a shawl and ran to her porch, where she could see the orange glow already rising from the far end of the bottom. Lord have mercy, she whispered, then turned and ran toward Reverend Tillman's home behind the church. She pounded on his door. Reverend! They're burning the bottom. Tillman appeared, already dressed, as if he'd been expecting trouble. Without a word, he reached under his bed and withdrew a cloth-wrapped bundle. He unwrapped it, revealing an old service revolver, a remnant from his father's Union Army days. Get everyone to the woods, he instructed Clara. I'll try to stop them. He rushed toward the flames, moving through shadows, the weight of the gun foreign in his hand. He'd never fired it, had kept it only as a reminder of his father's sacrifice for freedom. Now, its cold metal represented a terrible choice between his faith and his people's survival. By the time Tillman reached the burning homes, Dunning and his men had moved on. 2 cabins stood fully engulfed, families huddled in the dirt road, watching their lives burn away. Tillman approached an old man who sat in the dust, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "What happened, Brother Johnson?" he asked, helping the man to his feet. "Sheriff and his boys," Johnson coughed through the smoke, "said they're teaching us a lesson. Heading to the jail next. They're taking Elijah." Tillman's blood ran cold. He looked toward town, where the courthouse lights glowed in the distance. He was too late. At the courthouse, 2 deputies dragged Elijah from his cell. The young man's legs buckled beneath him, weak from days without proper food, his face still bruised from his initial beating. They half carried, half dragged him to the back of a wagon. "Please," Elijah begged. "I didn't do nothing." "Shut up, boy," one deputy snarled, binding his hands behind his back. Time to make an example. They threw a rough sack over his head and tossed him into the wagon bed like a sack of grain. The driver snapped the reins, and they headed out of town toward the hanging tree, a massive oak that stood alone in a clearing beyond the north road. In the woods bordering the bottom, Clara moved among the frightened families, counting heads and organizing the chaos. "Stay together," she urged. "We'll head deeper in, toward the creek." When she spotted Reverend Tillman approaching through the trees, she rushed to meet him. "They've got Elijah," he said grimly, taking him to the hanging tree. Clara's face hardened. "Then we've got no choice." She turned and called out, "Mr. Jefferson! Mr. Robeson! We need you now!" From among the gathered families, 5 older men stepped forward. These were the veterans, men who had fought in France during the Great War, who had returned to find the country they defended still treated them as less than human. "Get your rifles," Clara instructed. "They're hanging that boy tonight." The men disappeared into the darkness, returning moments later with weapons they'd hidden throughout the woods in preparation for this moment. Tillman watched them check their ammunition, their movements efficient and practiced. His hand tightened around his own revolver, doubt warring with determination in his heart. "Reverend Jefferson," the oldest of the veterans, said quietly, "I know what you're thinking, but sometimes the Lord expects us to defend ourselves." "There are children here," Tillman replied, gesturing to the families. "If we start shooting—" "If we don't," Clara cut in, "they'll hang Elijah and come for these children next. No more dying quiet, Reverend. Not tonight." Tillman closed his eyes briefly. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier. When he opened them again, his decision was made. "No more dying quiet," he echoed with a slow nod. "But we do this smart. No shooting unless absolutely necessary." The veterans nodded solemnly. "Jefferson, you and Robeson come with me to the hanging tree. The rest of you stay here. Protect these people if Dunning's men return." Clara stepped forward. "I'm coming too." Tillman knew better than to argue. "We move fast and quiet. We need to get there before they do." In the distance, the sound of hoofbeats faded as Dunning's riders headed toward the hanging tree. The black defenders spread out through the pines, following carefully by lantern light, moving through familiar woods they had hunted in since childhood. The veterans' faces were grim but resolute, rifles held steady as they advanced. Clara's eyes burned with a fury born from years of silent suffering, and Reverend Tillman prayed with each step, asking forgiveness for what they might have to do before dawn. The stage was set for confrontation. In the clearing ahead, the hanging tree waited, its massive branches stretching against the star-filled sky like accusing fingers pointed at heaven. Pink light crept over the eastern horizon, smearing the sky with bloody fingers of red and gold. The hanging tree stood on a small rise outside town, its massive trunk scarred from previous executions. its branches strong enough to bear a man's weight. Under its shadow, a flatbed wagon had been positioned, a makeshift gallows for a town without patience for proper justice. Sheriff Dunning's men dragged Elijah from the back of a horse cart. His feet were bare and bloody from the journey, his shirt torn, revealing fresh bruises across his ribs. They half-carried him to the wagon, his legs buckling beneath him. "Stand up, boy," growled Deputy Carl, shoving him roughly. "Die like a man, at least." Elijah straightened as best he could, his eyes unfocused, lips cracked and dry. The sack they'd kept over his head during the ride had been removed, leaving his hair dusted with burlap fibers and sweat. The crowd that gathered was different from the jeering mob of days before. About 30 white townspeople stood in a loose semicircle, their faces tight with tension rather than hatred. Some looked away when Elijah's gaze passed over them. Others clutched shotguns or rifles, scanning the tree line nervously. "Not so brave without an audience, are they?" Clara whispered from her position behind a thick pine, watching through a gap in the branches. Beside her, Reverend Tillman gripped his revolver, his knuckles white. "They know what they're doing is wrong," Tillman replied softly. "Look at their faces. That's not justice they're feeling." The veterans had spread out through the trees, surrounding the clearing, each man hidden behind thick trunks with rifles aimed at the gathering. They'd moved silently through the forest paths they'd known since childhood, reaching positions before the sheriff's party arrived. In the clearing, Sheriff Dunning stood beside the wagon, unfolding a piece of paper with exaggerated ceremony. The rising sun cast long shadows across his face, deepening the lines around his mouth. "By the authority vested in me," he called out, his voice carrying across the clearing, "I hereby pronounce judgment on Elijah Carter for the crime of assault against a white woman." A few men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't a trial, not even a pretense of one. "Having heard the evidence and determined guilt," Dunning continued, "I sentence him to hang by the neck until dead." Elijah's head dropped slightly, his lips moving in silent prayer. Then, barely audible, he whispered, "Mama, I'm sorry, Mama." A rope with a prepared noose dangled from the strongest branch above the wagon. Deputy Carl climbed up to place it around Elijah's neck, yanking it tight enough to make the young man gasp. In the trees, Reverend Tillman raised his revolver, sighting down the barrel at Dunning's chest. His finger trembled on the trigger. "Wait," Clara breathed, touching his arm. "Not yet." Jefferson, the oldest veteran, crouched nearby, his rifle steady. "Give the word, Reverend, and we end this." Tillman hesitated. If they opened fire, people would die on both sides. The aftermath would be a bloodbath for the entire black community. But if they did nothing, Elijah would surely hang. Sheriff Dunning raised his hand, preparing to give the signal that would send the wagon rolling forward, leaving Elijah to strangle slowly in front of the crowd. "Any last words, boy?" he asked, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Before Elijah could answer, a clear voice rang out across the clearing. "Stop!" Every head turned. Clara Jenkins walked from the tree line, her back straight, her steps measured and deliberate. She wore a simple blue dress, her gray-streaked hair pulled back severely from her face. She carried no weapon, only a folded piece of paper clutched in one hand. "This ends now," she called, her voice steady and strong. Sheriff Dunning's hand dropped to his gun. "Get back to the bottom, woman, before you join him." Clara didn't break stride. "You're hanging an innocent boy on a lie, Earl Dunning, and everybody here knows it." Behind her, silent as shadows, 24 black men emerged from the trees, the veterans of the Great War, their rifles raised and ready. They formed a line at the edge of the clearing, neither advancing nor retreating. The white crowd gasped. Some raised their weapons, while others began backing away. "What the hell is this?" Dunning shouted, drawing his pistol and aiming it at Clara. "This is insurrection!" Clara continued walking until she stood just 20 feet from the wagon. She lifted the folded paper high above her head so everyone could see it. "This is May Belle Dalton's signed confession," she announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent clearing. "Written in her own hand and witnessed by Reverend Tillman. She states clearly that Elijah Carter never touched her, never so much as looked at her wrong." "She's lying!" Dunning snarled, but uncertainty flickered across his face. "The girl confessed 3 nights ago," Clara continued, unwavering despite the gun pointed at her chest. "Came to the church crying about how her lie was killing an innocent boy. Asked God's forgiveness. Now I'm asking if you men want that sin on your souls, too." No one moved. The morning breeze rustled the leaves overhead, making the noose swing slightly beside Elijah's head. Reverend Tillman stepped from the trees now, joining Clara. He still held his revolver, but kept it pointed at the ground. "We don't want bloodshed," he said calmly, "but we will not watch this boy die for a crime that never happened." The standoff stretched, taut as a bowstring. On one side the sheriff and his men, their authority suddenly uncertain. On the other, Clara Jenkins with her damning paper, backed by armed men who'd once fought for America in foreign trenches. And in the middle, Elijah Carter, the noose still tight around his neck, watching with disbelieving eyes as people from the bottom risked everything to save his life. The clearing fell silent, except for the rustle of wind through the branches. The great oak creaked overhead, its ancient limbs bearing witness to the standoff below. Clara Jenkins stood firm, her arm raised high, the confession paper caught in the morning light. "We have her words," Clara declared, her voice carrying across the tense space. "You hang that boy, and this paper goes to the state. Not just to the governor, but to every newspaper from here to Jackson." Sheriff Dunning's jaw tightened. His pistol remained pointed at Clara, but doubt flickered across his face. "You think anyone's going to believe a bunch of coloreds over a white girl's daddy?" he sneered, but his voice lacked conviction. "That paper could say anything." "Call my bluff, then," Clara challenged, taking another step forward. "How sure are you, Sheriff? Sure enough to have your name in papers across Mississippi? Sure enough for state troopers to come asking questions about why you hanged a boy without trial?" Dunning's face reddened. He glanced at the white townspeople behind him, searching for support, but found mostly uncertain eyes. "This is nothing but a desperate lie," he shouted, more to the crowd than to Clara. "Now step back before—" The thunder of hooves interrupted him. All heads turned toward the road where a horse approached at a gallop. Atop it sat May Belle Dalton, her blonde hair flying loose, her dress wrinkled and damp with morning dew. She pulled the reins hard, bringing the animal to a skidding halt at the edge of the clearing. "Stop!" she cried, her voice high and strained. "Stop this right now!" She slid from the saddle, stumbling as she hit the ground. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide with terror and resolve. "It's true!" May Belle shouted, pointing at Elijah on the wagon. "He never touched me! Not once!" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Dunning lowered his pistol slightly, his mouth hanging open. "May Belle!" Henry Dalton pushed through the crowd, his face twisted with rage and panic. "You get back home this instant! You don't know what you're saying!" "I know exactly what I'm saying, Daddy," she sobbed, backing away from him. "I can't let him die for something that never happened. I won't have that on my soul." Dalton lunged forward and grabbed her arm, yanking her roughly. "You shut your mouth, girl. You don't understand what you're doing to this family." "Let her speak," Reverend Tillman called out, stepping closer. "The truth wants telling, Mr. Dalton. Let it be heard." The crowd seemed frozen between two worlds, the old certainties crumbling, new revelations taking shape. Deputy Carl looked to Sheriff Dunning for direction, but the sheriff stood paralyzed, watching his authority dissolve before his eyes. "Tell them, Daddy," May Belle pleaded, trying to pull away from her father's grip. "Tell them why you made me lie." "Shut up!" Dalton hissed, shaking her. "It wasn't Elijah," she cried, her voice breaking. "I never even spoke to him before that day." Henry Dalton's composure finally shattered. "You think I'd let you ruin us?" he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "After I caught you with that Wilson boy behind the mill? His daddy's my partner? What would people say if they knew my daughter was sneaking around with a married man's son?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Maybelle stopped struggling, her face draining of color. Complete silence fell over the clearing. Henry Dalton seemed to realize what he'd said. He released Maybelle's arm and stepped back, his eyes darting around the circle of stunned faces. I did what any father would do," he stammered. "I had to protect my family name." "By sending an innocent boy to his death?" Clara's voice cut like a knife. More townspeople backed away from Dunning and Dalton, murmuring among themselves. A few lowered their weapons entirely. The carefully constructed story, the foundation of their righteous anger, had crumbled before their eyes. Sheriff Dunning watched his control slipping away. He holstered his pistol with a trembling hand, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "This," he began, then faltered. "This changes nothing." "The boy still—" "The boy did nothing," Reverend Tillman interrupted, moving deliberately toward the wagon. "And you know it now, same as everyone here." The sheriff's shoulders sagged. The performance was over. The audience no longer believed. Without the crowd's fear and anger to manipulate, he was just a man with a badge, outnumbered and exposed. Reverend Tillman reached the wagon and climbed up beside Elijah. With steady hands, he removed the noose from the young man's neck, tossing the rope to the ground with quiet contempt. Elijah collapsed against him, sobbing silently, his body shaking. "It's over, son," Tillman whispered, holding him upright. "You're going home." The white crowd began to disperse, backing away toward the road, toward town, toward homes where they would have to live with what they'd almost done. No one spoke. Their footsteps rustled through the dry grass, fading slowly. Sheriff Dunning remained, standing alone by the tree, his authority as withered as fallen leaves. From the trees, the black veterans emerged fully now, lowering their rifles. They formed a protective circle around the wagon as Tillman helped Elijah down. Clara joined them, taking Elijah's hand in hers. Someone began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Another voice joined, then another. The hymn took shape, words forming around the melody. We shall not be moved." The song spread through the gathering, gaining strength with each voice. Maybelle watched, tears streaming down her face, as the black community closed ranks around Elijah, lifting their voices in defiance and relief. Just like a tree that's planted by the water, we shall not be moved. 2 weeks after the hanging that never happened, Dover's Hollow rested under a gentle autumn sun. The blackened frames of burned cabins in the bottom stood like skeletons against the sky, but between them, new structures rose. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air where hymns had once echoed in defiance. Elijah Carter moved among the workers, his steps uneven but determined. The bruises on his face had faded to yellowish smudges, but the limp, a gift from Sheriff Dunning's boot, remained. He carried boards to where they were needed, measured twice before each cut, and showed the younger men how to join corners so they would stand against the Mississippi winds. "A little higher on that side, Marcus," he called to a teenage boy balancing on a beam. His voice was still soft, but it carried authority now, the weight of a man who had stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. Old Man Jackson, who had fought in France during the Great War, worked beside him. "You got a good eye," he told Elijah. "Better than most of these youngsters." Elijah nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "My daddy taught me before he passed. Said a man should know how to build something that lasts." Across the settlement, Reverend Tillman knelt alone in the small church that had survived the fires. The floorboards beneath the pulpit were pried loose, revealing dark earth below. From his pocket, he withdrew a glass jar sealed with wax. Inside was Maybelle's confession, the paper that had saved Elijah's life. "For history," he whispered, placing the jar in the hollow space, "so no one forgets what happened here." He replaced the boards carefully, hammering them flush so no one would notice the disturbance. Some truths needed protection, seeds planted deep to sprout in safer seasons. As he worked, Clara Jenkins appeared in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the daylight. "They're leaving," she said simply. Reverend Tillman nodded and followed her outside. Down the road, a wagon loaded with trunks and furniture rolled slowly toward the county line. Henry Dalton sat rigid on the driver's bench, staring straight ahead. Beside him, Maybelle hunched small and pale, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. No one in Dover's Hollow had spoken to them since the morning at the hanging tree. "Where will they go?" asked the Reverend. Clara shrugged. "Her aunt's place in Tennessee, I heard. Somewhere people don't know their story." "And the sheriff?" "Resigned yesterday. Said he's heading to Texas." Clara's mouth curved in something not quite a smile. "Seems he doesn't feel welcome anymore." They watched the wagon disappear around a bend. Neither spoke the obvious truth. That exile was a gentler punishment than what Elijah had faced. That justice remained imperfect, bent toward mercy for some, but rarely for others. By late afternoon, Elijah finished his day's work and made his way to Clara's cabin, which had been spared from the fires. She had set up a small workshop on her back porch, where 3 young men from the bottom waited with restless energy. "You're late, Mr. Carter," Clara said, but her eyes were warm. "Roads slow me down these days," Elijah replied, gesturing to his leg. The boys, none older than 16, straightened when he approached. They had been waiting for this moment all week. Clara had arranged it after seeing how the younger men watched Elijah work, how they mimicked his careful measurements and precise cuts. "These boys want to learn proper carpentry," she had told him, "and you need something to do besides brooding." Now Elijah stood before his first students, suddenly unsure. He had never taught anyone anything before. "I ain't a proper carpenter," he began hesitantly. "Just know what my daddy showed me." "That's more than they know," Clara said firmly. "Start with the basics. Show them how to respect the wood." So he did. He taught them how to feel the grain with their fingertips, how to spot knots and weaknesses, how to choose the right tool for each task. The boys listened with intense concentration, their eyes following his scarred hands as they demonstrated each technique. "Wood remembers," he told them quietly. "Every cut, every nail. Do it right, and it holds together through storms. Do it wrong, and it falls apart when you need it most." Later, walking home through the deepening twilight, Elijah realized something had shifted inside him. The teaching had awakened something, a purpose beyond mere survival. The towns remained separate, but changed. White customers returned to the colored laundresses and yard workers, but their eyes now fell away when confronted. The shame of what had nearly happened hung over Dover's Hollow like a low cloud, impossible to disperse, but gradually thinning with time. In the bottom, caution remained, but so did a new certainty, the knowledge that unity had power. When the mill owner tried to cut wages, he found his black workers standing together, refusing the cut as one body. When a white deputy spoke roughly to old Mrs. Williams at the market, Clara Jenkins appeared beside her, silent but unflinching, until the man walked away. It wasn't peace, not truly, but it was a truce born of reckoning. The powerless had shown their strength, and the powerful had glimpsed their own moral poverty. 15 years passed. Dover's Hollow grew and changed with the times. The war came and went, taking some of its sons and returning others changed forever. On a bright spring morning in 1946, Elijah Carter, now a man of 34 with threads of silver in his close-cropped hair, stood before a small building at the edge of what had once been called the Bottom. The schoolhouse had been his project for 3 years, built with donated lumber and the labor of his former students, now skilled carpenters themselves. Inside, 20 children sat at rough-hewn desks, learning their letters and numbers from Miss Pearson, a young woman who had returned from college up north with dreams of educating the next generation. Elijah positioned a wooden sign above the doorway, carefully aligning it before securing it in place with brass screws. He had spent months carving the letters by lamplight, each groove and curve a meditation on memory and promise. The words, stained dark against the pale wood, read, "We shall not be moved." He climbed down from his ladder, stepped back, and regarded his work. His fingers reached up to touch the carved letters, feeling the smooth depressions his tools had made. The hymn that had saved him all those years ago now stood as testament, not just to that night, but to all the days that followed, all the small resistances and quiet dignities that had gradually transformed their world. From inside the schoolhouse came the sound of children's laughter, bright and unafraid. Elijah listened, a faint smile touching his lips. The future these children would inherit wasn't perfect, wasn't even close to just, but it was different from the one he had faced at their age. And that difference, however small, had been carved from the impossible by hands just like his. The sign caught the morning light, throwing the words into sharp relief against the weathered building. "We shall not be moved," a promise kept, a victory preserved, a memory honored. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.